Okay, now we are in streaming.
Okay, so thank you very much. Welcome to everybody. Welcome to AGLAIA McCLINTOCK for having organized this meeting, and welcome to Judith HALLETT. It's a long time we didn't meet each other, right?
In Washington, yes, exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. It was, I'd say, more than 10 years ago.
Yes.
We had a wonderful afternoon, spent a wonderful afternoon in Washington, D.C., in Georgetown.
Yes.
And it was very nice conversations. First time we met in person, and it's pity that we just are talking through the internet, but it's better than nothing. I think I don't need to spend too many words to introduce Professor HALLETT. She has taught for many years at the University of Maryland, and among as her works, I can of course recall Fathers and Daughters in Roman Society, Women and the Elite Family, published by Princeton in 1984. And then together with Marilyn Skinner, she edited Roman Sexualities, published again in Princeton in 1997. Then another book was Women Writing Latin, published by Routledge in 2002. And then she published Women in the Ancient World and Companion to the Ancient Novel. From just this short list of her many works, you can see that her work and her research, her publication, focused on subjects such as women, family, sexuality in ancient Greece and Rome, and particularly in Latin literature. And so now she is here to discuss with me and with you, with all the people who are connected now, to discuss AGLAIA McCLINTOCK's book, whose title is La ricchezza femminile e la lex Voconia. Exactly, that's exactly the book that Judith has just shown to you. This book is dedicated to a very famous law, a very famous Roman law, but a law that we don't know very much, actually. We don't have the complete text. We have just some pieces of this law, and the discussion on the real meaning of the Lex Voconia has been very long in the centuries, and mostly in the last years. Which is the reason of the fact that this law is very famous. The law was established in 169 BC, so after basically the Second Punic War. It's called Voconian law because it was introduced by a certain Voconius, but with strong support from Cato the Elder. And apparently, this law prohibited the rich Roman who owned very big properties from making a woman their heir. This is basically what we know for sure of this law. And then in addition, there was also another prohibition. It prohibited a legacy in a will, which was of a value greater than the inheritance of the ordinary heirs. And with probably it's quite probable that the meaning of this law, the intention of the lawyer, was to limit the wealth available to women, because they were presumed to expend all this money on luxury goods. And in this case, this law is connected to another famous Roman law, which was the law Oppia, the Lex Oppia. In order to deal with some important points of this law, I think I might just begin by asking Judith to tell us something about this law, and to start making some questions to AGLAIA, and to let you know which were the most significant parts of this law.
So thank you, Simone and AGLAIA. Thank you on many different counts. First, for including me, because I'm not a lawyer. I've never studied the law. Secondly, thank you for letting me speak in English. Both AGLAIA and I have roots in the suburbs of Philadelphia. Her father grew up in the town next to mine. We promise not to resort to Philadelphia dialect, which is more complicated than the Neapolitan, with phrases such as down the shore. But most importantly, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to address the many questions that have been raised by AGLAIA's rich and stimulating body of research, because this monograph is only the most recent of her efforts. She's written this extraordinary article, it's almost 10 years ago now, in a Belgian journal. If it's all right, I would like to proceed by posing a series of questions on the Lex Voconia, which will provide answers. And I like to offer thanks in posing these questions. Thanks for several of these ideas to some of my younger colleagues who are working in this area. One is Lisa Mignone from Columbia University, whose father comes from Benevento. Another is Anise Strong Morse from Western Michigan University, and yet another is Gregory Giles at King's College London, all of whom are doing impressive, innovative, interdisciplinary research on elite Roman Republican women and on their money, and approaching this topic from various vantage points. Some of my questions are much longer than others, but we're going to start with a short, what we call a double-barreled question from Lisa Mignone, which is, AGLAIA, why was there a need for the Lex Voconia? And exactly how was it bypassed? How did people get around it?
Thank you so much, Judith. Thank you, Simone. And thank you really all the friends and colleagues that are so dear to me. And thank you for your support to this work. Now, let's answer this question. Well, of course, you all know that women lived longer. They still live longer than men. The men went at war. They managed these estates. We have so many scholars here today that have published exciting work on the property of women. The problem is, why were they so rich? This is the question that we have to ask ourselves. They were so rich because they inherited, and until the Lex Voconia, at least the richest part of Roman society, they could inherit from both families, the family they were born in, so from their father, from their mother, from their relatives, and from the father and from the family they married in, so even from their husbands, and basically until 169 from anyone, even from an extraneous. why was there a need for Lex Voconia? The interesting thing, as Simone already pointed out, is that Lex Voconia is not for everyone. Lex Voconia was aimed at what we call today in Anglo-Saxon, the 1% of the population who holds the economic power, because this is what at least the first rule for certainly, and perhaps the second provision of the law, were considered the citizens that were registered in the first class of the census. So it was aimed at the very, very richest part of Rome. Why did they need it? Well, the problem is that women were the start, the beginning, and the end of their families. They did not have heirs as such. They were celebrated as mothers, as we have all studied, as we all know, but they were divided from their children, because if there was no law if there was no will in the intestate succession, the children did not inherit from them, and they could not inherit from their children. So there was this big division between them that, of course, is linked with patria potestas, but it is a property problem. And so what happens in the Republic? The will is the means of freedom, is the means of a rich woman of doing whatever she wants with her property. And as we lawyers would say, when something is not prohibited, it is possible to do. And so they did. They used the wills to give their children inheritance. And of course, you know that property does not come by itself. Property comes with power. Property comes with clientele. Property comes with relations. Property comes with political influence. So we will see maybe later, it is not so shocking that that scholarship always asks, why the 1%? Because the 1% is the one that matters. And and the second question of Judith was, what was it? Why was it bypassed? Well, this is another big problem that we will have to discuss together. There are many, many attempts of elusion of this law, because there was a part of Roman society that did not like the law, and it actually was very vocal in saying that did not approve of this law. And so there are many cases of illusions quoted in Cicero. So this would be my answer to the first question.
So Lisa has a follow-up question, which is, how much wealth did women in the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE actually have? Owing to Livy's account, which is of course much later, of the Lex Oppia debate in 195 BCE, we tend to think of women's wealth in terms of jewels and carriages and fine clothing and beautiful ornaments. But how do our sources on the Lex Voconia complicate that picture?
Oh, thank you for the wonderful question. Thank your colleague. They complicate it a lot, because jewelry is only the top of the iceberg of the wealth. It's just what you see on display of the property. And of course, it is very visible, and it is also, it will be used in the symbolic stereotypes of women, of bejeweled women parading around Rome that have to be stopped, that are too dedicated to luxury, that spend too much. So this is part of, also of the bias against women. But actually, well, now Julia, who is here, who is studying property, could answer to this question better than I can. And if she wants to kick in, I will like the help. Anyway, you all know that in 42 before Christ, as in Appian's report of what happened with Hortensia, he actually counted the women, and there were 400 of which had more than 100,000 denarii. Now, in Leo Pepe's book Civis Romana, edited by Grifo, which is a 500 pages book, Leo really makes you understand how rich these women were. Just think of Pudentilla, the widow that Apuleius married and had to bear a trial for marrying such a rich woman. I don't remember the exact figure, but Leo can help me. He actually counted that she was, I mean, it's not that she is a little rich, she's like Margherita Agnelli. We're speaking of hundreds of millions of euros. So these are fortunes, they're not normal wealth. These are Amazon wealth. I mean, this kind of money we're speaking of. And just to make one example that is in my last chapter, where I actually go in technical problems of Roman law of succession, I was very much struck and shocked by the story of Lollia Paulina, the wife of Caligula, who then divorced her. And Pliny the Elder is very, in my view, I may be wrong, but in my view, he is very misogynistic, because he meets her at a banquet, a wedding banquet, and he says that it's not a very chic banquet, it's just, you know, normal people, and that she was overdressed. So again, the bias on the woman, because he says the little things. So he is also commenting on her stature, that she was a tiny lady, was completely covered of emeralds and pearls from her the tips of her hands to the toes, to her toes. And so the comment is, well, this is how Caligula must be spending state money. And I find that even if all the story is misogynistic, we can see that clearly she answered very pointedly to Pliny, because she said that she had le tabule, she had the receipts. She could, per tabulas, show that she had bought each and every piece of jewelry by herself, or that she had ordered it from her jeweler. And think that this woman was so rich that, and well, then there is the last comment of Pliny, who says she had inherited her wealth. It was not Caligula, so Caligula had married a very wealthy woman, and she had inherited from her grandfather, who had exploited the Roman provinces, and who had gifts from Oriental kings. So this is and then follow other insults on all the family of Lollia Paulina. What I find interesting is that she was so wealthy that she was able to live in the imperial court for 10 years after her divorce, which was not easy, and also that she was a runner-up to marry Claudius. But then, of course, Agrippina was a big enemy, and then in the end, all her money was confiscated, except 4 millions of sesterzi, which I wonder where they went, but that will be the source for another story. So that's my answer.
Oh, thank you. And a footnote to that, shortly after 42 BCE, in the second satire of his first book of satires, Horace tells men not to have extramarital sexual relations with women who are bejeweled with emeralds and pearls. But now I'm going to ask you a longer question, and it's what we call a connect the dots question. I don't know if you have that, that idiom in Italy, and that is, how are you going to connect the Lex Voconia, this is 169 BCE, and connect it historically, economically, and legally with a very famous anecdote that's first related by the 1st century CE Roman moralistic writer Valerius Maximus, but is also related by the 2nd century CE Greek biographer Plutarch, and it's about Cornelia, the daughter of Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus, the great general and statesman, and the mother of the radical political reformers Gaius and Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus. And it's a story about her and her sons, namely that when a lavishly bejeweled emerald and pearls Campanian matron confronted her and asked her about her absence of expensive ornaments on her dress, Cornelia pointed to her young sons who had just come back from school, and she replied, "These are my jewels." So, where were Cornelia's jewels?
Well, thank you for the question. You know, this is my favorite. Yes, let's connect the dots. Actually, I graduated on the Lex Voconia, and the first book I think that I read was yours, Fathers and Daughters, and Eva Cantarella's Passato Prossimo. And that's where I fell in love with Roman law. And so it's not true that you do not address Roman law. And that's where I actually first met the Scipio's family, and I was interested. I mean, who is not interested in jewelry? And it always sounded to me very weird that Cornelia had said to the companion mother, "These are my jewels," not because she didn't love the Gracchi, or not because she didn't. I mean, it sounded strange. Anyway, Polybius, of course, is very detailed in explaining the very intricate succession of the Scipios that must have been the gossip of the town, and it must have hit the headlines, as now in Italy. I don't know if you're aware, Judith, but the Agnelli, there is an Agnelli family feud. The Agnellis who owned the Fiat are, you know, it's always the same story. The daughter says that her son has been named as higher, and she did not have the opportunity to be heir of her father. It's always the same story, because it's always, let's not segment the big factories. Let's not segment the big productions. Well, where are the jewels? What happened was that Emilia Scipio Africanus died before the Lex Voconia, so he was certainly first class. He was still able to leave to whoever he wanted. I believe that he left his inheritance to Emilia, also because there is a silence in the sources about the male representatives of the family. Yes, and also because she appears as to be one of the prominent women in Rome, of which everyone speaks. Her attire was very famous. As Julia pointed out to me in our last conference, her jewels had been taxed by Cato 10 times their worth. So, I mean, everyone knew about her public attire. And then when she dies in a couple years after 169, she is now prevented from leaving her substance, her property, to whoever she wants. And she has an adoptive, Scipio Africanus has an adoptive grandson who is Scipio Emilianus. She, of course, is Republican royalty. Everyone is looking at her to see what she's going to do. Cato's speeches seem to be aimed at her. I really do believe that there is a personal motivation behind the law as well. Yeah, as well. I can't believe there is not. And what really is wrong is that Scipio Emilianus, as soon as he becomes heir of Emilia, because the Cornelia could not be heirs for the Lex Voconia, well, the first things he does, he pays these 2 huge dowries, and then he gives all this famous jewelry to Papiria, his mother, who was poor and destitute and could not join the public religious functions because she didn't have enough jewelry to go to. She didn't have enough clothes. And then when she dies, he gives this jewelry to the 2 sisters, Emilia. So always away from his adopted family and always towards his natural family. And Scipio Emilianus, of course, was married with Sempronia, who was the daughter of Cornelia. And I have found technically in Roman law that there is a pattern of giving your heirlooms and also your jewelry to your daughter or to your granddaughter, or at the worst to your daughter-in-law. But there is a female transmission of this kind of mobile property. So it is very strange that the man is in charge of rearranging this. And also there's another fact. If he gives it to the two sisters, he divides the jewelry. So they're not one recognizable apparatus that everyone knows, and they know, oh, these are the Scipios. It's like saying, oh, these are the Kennedys, or these are the Trumps, or these are the new to make it clearer. And so Judith, there is something real in Valerius Maximus, because when he says that the Campanian woman was boasting her jewelry, we still have in Naples, we say that when you put on too much jewelry, you look like La Madonna dell'Arco. We still have this problem. We tend to overdo it in Campania. And so if she was boasting, it meant that she was being very rude and indelicate to Cornelia, because she was reviving something that should have been hers, and that it hasn't been hers.
Exactly. Do you want to say anything about Cornelia's answer, though?
Oh, yes.
And why her relationship to her sons, who are being educated for political leadership, is important.
Yes, that's very important, because of course the answer is pointed, and she shares some male values, but she is I mean, she's in some way she's an accomplice, because she says, well, I don't care of the jewelry, because I made the two male children, so I am able to make two politicians. So I am custodian of those male values, and I am actually the best one, the best mother in Rome, and I will be the best mother in Rome for the end of times, because we still used to study it in school, because she prefers children over jewelry, which is also a stereotype. It is not, I mean, it could be seen ethically differently somehow. I like Cornelia. I thought I think she's very smart, but I do think she is at least how she's represented. She is the custodian of male values in that.
So I want to follow this up by connecting something else you've been arguing very convincingly, which is that the Lex Voconia promoted the assumption that only males should function as the primary heirs of a family's wealth. So you've given one example, but you could give some more about how wealthy women who were promoting these male relatives, how did they publicly seek to reject stereotypically feminine behavior? And how else did they embrace public conduct that was traditionally associated with males? And you might want to talk about some larger theoretical issues here too, because that's what's very impressive about your analysis.
Thank you, Judith. Thank you really for these questions. Well, this is a very complicated question. Probably the Roman society was divided, but here I'm really making a reach. I might be wrong, but I find that the expressive theory of law is very helpful to describe the motivations of the Lex Voconia, because there are some, I don't want to get into the problems of the Chicago school, because there's a huge debate on that, on which is the real one, which is the old, the new, and who is in, who is out. It's very complicated. But Tom McGinn and Adrian Lanni for the Greek law, Tom McGinn for the Roman law, have applied their classicists, the expressive, this modern economic theory of law, the expressive function of law, to the classical world, I think with good results. And what is this this law? Well, what is this theory? It says that there are some laws that are not aggressively enforced. I mean, and this would also explain all the illusions that we have of the law, the many kinds of illusions that we have. Usually they, one of the very, very basic examples that they do is the one of the non-smoking non-smoking ban prohibition, that there are not many fines have been issued, that it was not so aggressively, because but the law stands and people have for a while stopped smoking, or at least diminished smoking, because of course there was a higher goal, that it was to prevent lung cancer, and also to diminish the, at least for where there is a public health system, to diminish the expense of the public health system in that area. So there are some laws that want to change how society behaves. And so they're not enforced in a very aggressive way. And actually, the Lex Voconia was not enforced in a very aggressive way, because we have so many exceptions. We have and women continue to be very, very wealthy even after the Lex Voconia. So how can we explain that? Why enforce a law that touches some people, but that some people are able to elude, that some people are able to force, or even simply they go against the law? Well, because there are various groups of population, dominant groups, that do not think in the same way. For example, Cicero didn't like it at all. He thought that women should have property. On the other hand, there was another part of the dominant society who thought that women should be wealthy, because of course they need them for marriages, for lineage, for everything. But that if you divide a big estate, then the estate doesn't produce as much. So if you fracture it, you lose it. And so what they want to set, in my opinion, is the principle that if you have a male heir, you should put everything on your male heir. If you don't have it, and you have an exceptionally good woman who will be the custodian of that property, and who is also like Cornelia, who you really know will give the property to the Gracchi, who will give it to her husband, who is completely accomplice of the system. Well, if the women are accomplice to the system, yes, they can certainly hold property for us, but they don't have to be the independent women who do whatever they want with the property. And I think this explains a lot also of our present, and explains a lot, or at least for me it does. It explains why we have so many problems in also in the political world, having women as representatives, because we also have not many women who are at the head of multinationals, or are the main owners of them, except when they hold it for someone else. So this is it is, of course, I'm pushing this. Of course, I'm pushing this this theory, and I think let me just give another example, the one of Tom McGinn for the Lex Eule and Pupia, because I think Judith can tell us something on that. He actually applied the expressive function of law on the Lex Eule et Pupia, as you all know, introduced to repopulate the empire by forcing, under penalty of the inability of men and women to receive by will, to marry and remarry, and to procreate an adequate number of children. Well, as Tom McGinn points out, the norms were in contrast with other values present in Roman society, such as that of personal freedom of citizens, which was dear to Romans, of the ruling class in choosing when, if, and whom to marry, and the fidelity for widowers to the memory of their deceased spouse. We have a long tradition of the matron who has only one husband. And so with his legislation, Augustine transformed into norm the values of one part of society. And we know from all the poets that there are other parts of society didn't like it at all. And some were exiled for not liking it at all. So in some way, I think that these laws, we could call them manifesto laws. Some laws to give you what is the right behavior. It doesn't matter if not everyone follows it, but at least the mainstream has to follow this rule for the preservation of society and tradition.
Exactly. And I would add that I don't think that the Augustan marriage laws were solely to increase the population in certain social classes. I think it was to increase the population so that the very wealthy families, other than Augustus's family, would have to divide their property up as more people married and had children. This absolutely confirms your assertion. So I'm now going to move to our sources, and I want to ask you, what do you see as, we could call them, the major perspectives? I would call them biases that inform these sources. And by this, I mean the eras and places in which they lived, the literary genres in which they wrote, their age and their social class when they wrote, and what we know from them and from other sources about their relationships with women from wealthy families. And so the question is, how do the backgrounds of these sources affect how they have represented the law and its purpose? And we can begin with Cicero. He's of particular interest. And then my next question will be about Cato. But let's start with Cicero. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
love this. This is like giving an exam. I hope I'm gonna
Yeah.
get a grade after.
Yeah.
I hope I pass the exam.
You're doing beautifully.
They're
Yeah.
wonderful questions. They're actually, if I had had these questions before, I would have written a better book. I'm realizing now that I really have to reconsider many things. I will for my future research. Now, this is another wonderful question. Now, while we usually have very biased, misogynistic, very horrible sources on women, and so it's a bit different for Lex Voconia. On Lex Voconia, we have lots of actually different sources. And as Judith pointed out, Cicero really doesn't like the law. And he states it very efficiently and very clearly in the Repubblica 3.17, where he says many things have changed, Manlius, from when you were an adolescent, when you were young. Many customs, many behaviors, many rules, everything is different. And there is something very bad that has been done against the women. Now, the exact wording is, there is a law that has been passed and for the advantage of men, and is full of injustice to women. For why should a woman not have money of her own? He asked himself. Why may a Vestal virgin have an heir, while her mother may not? Because Vestal virgins were the only one of the exceptions, or at least the only well, there are two exceptions, but one exception to the Lex Voconia, because they had total freedom in naming whoever they wanted as heirs. So Cicero really disapproves of the law that forbids a mother from choosing her daughter as an heir. And I think that really Judith's seminal work, Fathers and Daughters, has explained a lot of why women are so wealthy and why they are also protected in some way. She used that word that I love, filia focality, because the filia, the relationship between father and daughter in Rome, is makes a total difference in society, restructures society in a completely different way. So here, for the Lex Voconia, we have one example of a topic that we can not only see from the bias point of view, but also from people who don't like this law, who do not share the same ideology, who do not share these same thoughts. Maybe even because Cicero was not as wealthy as the people, because the last sentence he says is against Licinius Crassus, who's of course one of the wealthiest men in Rome. And so he was going against the because he didn't like, he saw that such enormous fortunes would be the end of the Republic. He could see it. I mean, he could see that to that extent. So this is what I would say. And also Saint Augustine, many centuries later, he says this law was, he cannot think of something more offensive to women. So there are many biases, and there's not only Cicero, there are many biases in the sources against the Lex Voconia.
So I'm going to now ask a very long and very philological question, because that's my area of expertise. And speaking of biases, the words of the elder Marcus Porcius Cato, the censor, whatever we want to call him, I call him the control freak, who lived from 234 to 149 BCE, and who supported the law that was proposed by the tribune. It had to be proposed by a tribune, Quintus Voconius Saxa. Cato's words are quoted by a much later source, the 2nd century CE author Aulus Gellius. But these are distinctive words because, in fact, they date from the time in which the law was passed as opposed to a later period. And I also want to connect them with another of Cato's speeches that's also quoted by Gellius, De Dote, on the dowry, because both of these speeches deal with legal and financial arrangements made by parents and particularly by fathers on behalf of their daughters. But the excerpts that are quoted, the excerpts that survive from both of these speeches, are addressed to and focused upon men in their role as husbands. The Lex Voconia speech does so in the second person plural. It uses the pronoun vobis, and it also repeatedly uses the noun vir, which means husband. And actually, another piece of evidence for this law, it's from a later Virgilian commentator, Servius. It has to do with a grammatical point, but that too talks about the potential of the law to deprive a vir, a husband, of the field that he owns. Now, the De Dote speech is fascinating because it emphasizes the rights and the power belonging to a husband, to a vir, in divorcing a sexually unfaithful wife, but also the rights and power lacking to a wife with a sexually unfaithful husband. It uses a succession of second person singular verbal subjunctive forms, prehendices, necades, the active adulterares, and the weird passive adulterare, in these past and present contrary to fact conditions, which I think implies that these are currently non-existent rights cruelly punishing women that Cato would like to put into effect. So my question is, why this focus on husbands? is it to discourage them from marrying the daughters of wealthy men? The kind of advantage that these women represent is similar to the advantages offered by the daughters of wealthy non Athenian fathers, whom the citizenship laws of Pericles in 451 BCE, whom his citizenship laws rendered ineligible to be mothers of Athenian citizen males. So, could we view Cato's negative characterization of wealthy women as wives as somehow a democratic stance, as an effort to create equality among all Roman men by disparaging the advantages that some might have by wedding a wife with inherited money and or a large dowry? And before I hand this over to you, I want to bring in a very important observation that you've made in your research, which is that we have these magical papyri that we'd expect to find girls seeking husbands who want love spells. But what these magical papyri consistently testify that they're these shrewd, ambitious, financially greedy men who want to marry a rich wife. So obviously, the men in Cato's audience needed convincing that a rich wife was not an asset but a detriment. So it's a long, long question, but answer it as you so wish.
Yeah, there are at least 10 questions inside here.
At least, maybe 20. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe 20. Well, so
Yeah.
okay. So let's start with the Cato negative criticism of the democratic stance. No, I don't think Cato has a democratic stance. I mean, if he had listened to your question, he thought he might be, but no, I don't think he had. He probably was. He just was defending male privilege, and he was maybe not seeing so far in the future that this law could be the beginning of primogeniture. I mean, it could be the beginning of the lex salica. It could be the beginning of always choosing a male and not women. So he maybe did not see so far. I don't know enough about it.
He marries his own son to Amelia's niece. Let's just start there.
Yeah, well, yes, true.
Yeah.
And he got some of the jewelry, so some of it, and he divided it. Yes, he might.
Yes.
Yes. But maybe not, but maybe more for hate than because he was democratic. I don't know. I see a lot of personal here. But what really strikes me of your question is that I want to actually restudy the Suasio, the speech and persuasion for the Lex Voconia, and the Dote together better, because I think this is you're giving me material for more research on this. And I totally agree with you that he is writing of laws that were not in effect. I don't think that a husband could kill so easily his wife. I'm quite sure that this is he's exaggerating for rhetoric aims, and I'm completely do agree. So why address husbands and not fathers? Exactly because you have already demonstrated it in your work. Because there is the filia focality. He could never address fathers would not vote for him. He had to address husbands who could be controlled by their wives, who still had, could be beat up by their wife, like in the Suasio of the Servus Receptitius, who just
talk about that. Yeah, great.
Who's this vile slave who is sent in the forum to ask for a loan that a wife gave to her husband. Well, did Cato succeed? No, he did not succeed because, as you pointed out, the magical papyri, which are much later, attest that they were always looking, that men were always looking for rich women. And I really love the thing that actually pretty women could have never been shot in Roman Hollywood, because it would have been the opposite, and richer gear would have been the so it would have been, I mean, it's completely different. There are no Cinderellas in Rome. There are men Cinderellas, and I like this opposition, at least from the sources that we have. And about the thing that you say about the citizenship laws of Pericles, I think that is also worth investigating. And there is, there is an example in Leo Pepe's book of a representative of the gens Fabia, if I'm not saying it wrong, who married a very rich Samnite woman. And there was a problem of citizenship and regarding the son, and this was in the archaic age. So I think certainly the policy with foreigners must have played a role to some effect, but I have not studied enough in this area, and I would have to deepen my studies in that direction. But I would say, to sum up the 20 questions, that Cato is the representative of the social group who does not approve of women's emancipation, who does not approve of independent female wealth. He made it clear in every possible way. And he is going against what he feels is a bad example. He also hates Cornelia, who in some way, as we said before, because even Cornelia is not accomplice enough. I mean, for him, women should be home and do the, the spinning, the wool spinning, and that's about it, I think.
And nurse the slaves' children so that they don't get pregnant again and produce more heirs for the master, but the slave women don't get to nurse their children and they get pregnant again, and you produce more slaves for Cato. So I have a couple of quick questions, and the first is from Lisa Mignone. Who controlled dowries, and were they kept liquid in the event of sudden divorces?
Yes, and also thank you, because this follows up something I forgot to say about the dowry. You were quoting the daughter of Cato. Why does he write a speech probably on the dowries? Because dowries are smaller property given to they are property of the wife, but they're managed by the husband. So they actually are basically completely in the hands of husbands, and they have to be they have to revert to the family that gave that property. And so it is a limited property. It's not like an inheritance where you can do whatever you want with it. And so of course, if you use this particular legal institute that is a dowry, you limit a lot female wealth. So men controlled dowries, were responsible for them. And just to quote one fun example connected to our family of the Scipios, when the brother, finally the natural father of Scipio Emilianus dies, Lucio Emilius Paulus, the two brothers were not able to repay the dowry of the second wife, the one that had replaced Papiria, and they had to actually sell the heirlooms and the furniture that was in the house and anything that they could find, even mattresses. And so this means that the dowries were not kept liquid, because they were used to raise the children. They were used for family life and for everyday life. So this is this is the answer to that. So he would prefer dowries to inheritance, I'm sure.
So I have a male sexuality question, and it takes us back to Cato's scenario about the problems that will be eliminated if the Lex Voconia passes, because he talks about, as you said, this male slave who was part of the property, belonging to the heiress wife, and who in this scenario would challenge the economic ownership and authority of her husband. This, the term is the servus ricchezza, whom the wife orders to pursue and harass her husband to get property back. So is he claiming that women's possession of male slaves, we haven't really talked about the slaves much, women's possession of male slaves who do their economic bidding, that they're somehow insulting and impugning not only the freeborn status, but the masculine prerogatives of husbands, that somehow these male slaves render these men effeminate because they can't control their property and a slave takes it away from them. I see some sexual anxieties here.
A lot of sexual anxiety, and this is another, I think this is another path of research that you're showing me or showing us, because yes, of course, also the fact that they own these male slaves that could be sex toys for the women, for the elite women, that could be used to effeminate their husbands. I think that you have a real point there, and I really would want to study it more. And I totally agree with you. I couldn't have said it better. I think it's there. She's insulting him, and she's insulting him publicly. So when some scholars have said that when Cato wrote this part of the speech for the Lex Voconia, he was thinking of Emilia. I don't think that Emilia would have ever done something so lowly, since she was a matron who was held for her public figure. But certainly, you know, this is it's almost comical the way that he's describing this part. It's almost a comedy from Plautus, this vile servant who is following the master in the forum and publicly, where everyone can see. I think also that the public eye is part of the problem. And yes, sexual anxiety is all over the place. Yes.
So let's get back to Emilia and two slaves that were in her possession. And the first is one she inherited from her late husband, who had been his sex toy. And she is remembered for having freed this woman whom she inherited from her husband, and at the same time marrying her to her own former male slave, who probably she'd inherited from her own father, and actually trying to repair the damages of her husband's sexual exploitation of this woman. It's a big contrast of how she deals with the slaves that have been mistreated in her family with Cato's imaginary comic confrontational scenario. Want to say anything about that?
Yes, well, that's also very interesting, because we know only the facts and we know nothing of the personal relations. So we don't know if she, by marrying her to her former slave, she is punishing her, or she's taking revenge for her being a sex toy. So this is very complicated. This is the problem.
Yeah.
We know only the facts. So we try to give a good interpretation. Well, maybe she is better well off married, but what if she's worse off married to someone who might rape her every day? We don't know. I mean, the problem is we know nothing of the personal relationship, and also Emilia is the most enigmatic of them all. Of Cornelia, we know some things. I mean, of Cornelia, as Leah and Tom have shown, we know some things. I mean, from the insults, from the thing, from how she defends herself, from how she constructs her, you can see some personality. But Emilia is the stereotype. It's very difficult to know what she was thinking when she freed the sex toy of her husband. I mean, I wouldn't know. And also, this is what always puzzles me of the ancient Rome is sometimes you're better off with a good husband who doesn't rape you. Sometimes you are better off when with your good father unmarried, and you prefer not to be married at all. So it's
Exactly.
really,
And I have argued that Plautus's Cassina, which is his final play right after Scipio dies, alludes to this whole episode
yes.
and makes it even more complicated. So I'll just ask one more question, and it's from Anise More Strong at Western Michigan University. To what extent can not only the Lex Voconia, but also the Lex Oppia be framed in terms of a larger societal, economic, and currency crisis rather than be accounted for by a more narrowly misogynistic explanation? And that is my final question, and I'm interested in how you respond.
Thank you so much, Judith. Thank you very much, so much for everything. Well, in my opinion, and this is of course, my opinion, and may be wrong, but I think really that Cato won a symbolic battle that arrives up to the present day. And I think that an observation by Tom McGinn is very real, that one should keep in mind that this law was always based on compromise, and if you don't base laws on compromise, you have public discussion, and then you have open protest. And so why did the women protest against the Lex Oppia? Why didn't they do anything about the Lex Voconia? So it means that somehow many women share the same male values, and they wanted their property to go to their children and to their husbands so that they could support their careers, and they could pride themselves, like Cornelia, of having put on the public scene the best Roman politicians. I think that, sorry, I think that the male domination by Pierre Bourdieu has been my standard in this kind of feminist and also in this kind of research, because I do believe that he is right when in his seminal work, The Male Domination, he says that you cannot really frame a history of women just pointing out recording the exclusion of women from this profession, from this career, from this or that kind of office, from the vote, and then only enumerate the 2 or 3 times that they actually protested over 2,000 years. But I think that he is always, it's a genius point that you have to research what he calls the invariance of domination. So where is the legal mechanism that makes me stay in the position where I was placed forever? And in this regard, I feel that the Lex Voconia is one of those mechanisms and one of those institutions that made possible the reproduction of an age-old domination of men. I think that preferring a male heir in the propertied classes is, under the eyes of everyone, is still today, is still up to today. It's not always, but it is the general rule. And, you know, 80% is enough. 80% of people who think this way is enough. And the male preference in inheritance with different features and declination would become sometimes also an interiorized rule, even if it's not set in principle by a law. The mother thinks, well, it's best I give everything to my son, because my son is able to protect the women of the family. It's also believing it is something that nature put this way. It's not true. The Romans put it this way because there was a moment that things were not exactly like this. And in France, the Salic law states that no portion of the inheritance shall come to a woman, but the whole inheritance of the land shall come to male sex. So the rule assigned land to men and was interpreted to exclude women from the succession to the throne, and it seems inspired to the Lex Voconia. Romans did not arrive to primogeniture, but that only little piece that we have of the Suasio of Cato, in which he says, a woman can take the land away from her husband.
Yeah.
And when he says land, he's saying the productive part of property. They don't mean to take away wealth from women. They want them to be wealthy, but maybe movable wealth like jewelry, maybe money, maybe sheep, maybe even small industries, but they don't want to fragment the property. And just to end this question, birthright with the related transfer to of the aristocratic title was exactly invented to avoid the fragmentation of assets and to maintain social prestige and political influence. You need the castle. Everyone who saw Downton Abbey knows that the castle goes to the male heir, or anyone who has read Jane Austen knows what happens to if you don't have a male heir. And in England, still at the beginning of the 19th century, restrictive rules of inheritance were enforced to preserve larger properties from being broken in small portions, which might weaken the power of the nobles and so of the representative of the politicians, entail restriction of inheritance to a limited class of descendants, and primogeniture, that means giving the title only and the land and the property only to the eldest son, were invoked to ensure that rights to real property, to landed property, would go to men. And today, the difficulty, I think, of women of breaking the glass ceiling has a long route. I think the Lex Voconia is part of it. Maybe I've studied it too many years and I am biased. But I think it is difficult to dismantle a system in which women have shared the same values of men. And if we don't understand these invariant of dominations, and if we don't understand how much we have interiorized these rules, I don't think we can really make real progress ahead of us.
Should we go back to Simone? Yeah.
Yes. I think that from the question asked by Judith and answers given by Aglaia, the audience now has a much fuller idea of this not very well-known law, but something that, as Aglaia has just said at the end of his last answer, has had a very important meaning in the history of women. These questions from the people who so kindly have taken part into this afternoon. If there is a question that someone from the audience wants to ask Aglaia.
Or Judith, or Simone also. We have exploited you. We have exploited you. Now females exploit males. It's
No, this is not true. Actually, one of the questions that I wanted to ask was about the question on the School of Chicago.
Oh.
I'm not an expert in Roman law, and I just met my life and my career Roman law when I translated Quintilian Institutio Oratoria. So when it was quite hard to translate the declamationes, this very complicated questions about law. So, but I found very interesting, really, the discussion that you made in the book, and also that you were able to express also in this meeting, about the fact that sometimes a law can be written but not enforced, just to, in a way, persuade people to change their mind and to behave in a different way. So that I found that part was really very interesting. So that was one question I wanted to ask, but Judith preceded me and you answered to this question. So
Thank you so much.
Again, if there is someone who wants to ask a question, I think that Aglaia would answer with pleasure to your questions.
But if there are not, I would really want to thank every one of you for being here, because I have studied most of your work, and the work that I have not yet read, I will read, I promise. And so really thank you, and especially our Australian friends. I think it's 4 o'clock at night, and so and really I think can we an applause for Judith, who has been so
Yes, exactly.
so kind.
Thank you very much, Judith.
Judith, you're so wonderful, and really thank you for the wonderful questions. And I feel so privileged to have had this discussion with you, and I promise I will do better. And this is all I can say.
I think you've done very, very well, and really pointed out the larger socio-cultural, linguistic, historical, economic implications of what would otherwise appear to be some minor little Roman legal event. I mean, you really opened up our horizons about what this law means, not only for Roman society, but for European and American society subsequently. So thank you for opening up the vistas.
Yeah. So let me close this session, and let me thank you again, Aglaia and Judith, and all the people who have been here. And I wish everybody a good day, a good afternoon, or morning, or
whatever is left
night, whatever, because people are from each part of the world. So thank you very much, and bye bye.
E anche ai miei studenti, grazie infinite, grazie. Vi chiamerò tutti singolarmente. Grazie.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Grazie
Bye
Francesca,
bye.
grazie Leo, grazie a tutti, grazie Pasquale, ciao, grazie.
Bye
Ciao,
bye.
grazie.
Grazie Rosario, puoi chiudere lo streaming, grazie. Grazie Cristina.